Well, let's get started. They'll join us in time. Thanks to all of you for your responses. I've collated them as I said I would. Excuse me. And I'm missing a few late ones. Well, a late one came in from Charlie, and a couple from Bruce Nelson, and so I can mention those later. Here's Don. Can we hear you, Don? No, are you on mute? Don? Can't hear you.
All right, I'm unmuted.
Oh, there you go. Okay. Before we get into those on the list, and that's quite a bit for us to talk about it, and I think we'll take up most of our time today, depending upon how we deal with it. But I thought before we did that, I thought we could talk about the things that Mill did anticipate. Not that he didn't anticipate, but what did he in fact anticipate on Liberty?
Well, I've mentioned all of religion several times in the essay. That's one of the things that still today divide us, according to our beliefs. So that was one thing.
Yeah, going along with the herd, and that goes for, I think throughout time, there's been a herd on one side and a herd on the other side, and the custom of the herd is to kind of go to the lowest common denominator to simplify everything, and then charge ahead with that distorted mission.
And one could equate that, or at least analogize that to the status of political discourse in this country, because you have at least two opposing points of view, and neither of them are paying attention to the other's point of view, and relying on the sort of the tyranny of the majority within their group. So that's something Mill clearly anticipated or was worried about.
So Mill is quite aware of that as being an issue.
I wrote down at one point the tendency of all opinions to become sectarian.
Mm-hmm.
So
Absolutely.
we're living with sectarianism.
Absolutely. I mean, we're in our silos. The other thing that I picked up, I only saw it in the short dissertation about the Mormons, how he wasn't too happy with the Mormons, but they should be left alone to do what they want to do. And he mentioned the subjugation of women within that group. And he felt that as long as they could get out from under it, well, that was tolerable, and I guess it's questionable in that case whether they can. And I understand that he also had some treatises on the treatment and equality of women.
He mentioned specifically wives. This is why I've not let my wife look at this essay.
Well, in Britain back then, a wife had no control over money whatsoever.
Right.
I mean, you talk about trying to, have your wife have your husband sign for a credit card application. The wife had no control over money. And I think John Stuart Mill and his wife they were ahead of their time, not massively. The very first women's rights conference in the United States took place in 1840 something. So I think Mill was on the right train. I don't think he invented it, but he certainly was a leader in writing about the rights of women.
His partnership with his wife was probably quite extraordinary, and I think she helped him flesh out and expand his writing. And it reminds me a little bit of the collaboration between John and Abigail Adams in the nature of the respect and dialogue they had with each other.
I read the beginning of the Subjection of Women that he wrote 10 years later in 1869. And it was interesting just on the first page relating to our conversation about passion and reason, that he says that women are equal to men in many ways, maybe not physically, but they should be, legally. And he says, over the decades, in spite of the reason behind this, the more reasons you give for the equality, the more the opposite side digs its heels in and comes up with any reason whatsoever to deny the truth. So he seems to be saying the opposite of something he said on Liberty, when he seems to give a great more effect to reason than to passion. He almost seems to be saying in the first page of this essay that passion seems to rule out against reason in the subjection of women.
Doesn't he say that though in On Liberty and a number of places also, that it's that reason takes a second place for a lot of people. In fact, most people.
Yeah, and that's part of that whole herd mentality driven by custom.
Yeah.
Right. He's right on, it seems to me, in his analysis of what he calls moral policing, the tendency of the majority to impose its moral values, and in the name of what they call social rights. I'd forgotten all about this discussion, but I think he's spot on. And in fact, one reason he wants to give individualism such wide room is because whenever you start whittling away at it, there is, I guess he would say, a human tendency to go overboard and to insist that everybody adhere to the values of the majority. And one particular aspect of that, people who are offended by other people's refusal to accept their values. Well, it seems to me we have a lot of that today. And once you accept this idea that he calls social rights, you've really lost any chance of individual freedom.
I liked his comments on bureaucracy. I thought he hit it right in talking about bureaucracy and the dangers of a bureaucracy. I'm not sure he ever gets the other side of it, because there's bureaucrats presumably, in my mind, are doing something that needs to be done. And I'm not sure it would be otherwise done but for the bureaucrats. But he does make some interesting comments on bureaucracy. So I enjoyed reading that.
Yeah, I thought I was very influenced by the last pages of applications, the last chapter, where he, I think, got right the fact that he sees a legitimate role for what he calls the superintendent central organ does have certain beneficial and legitimate roles in life. And the difficulty is in balancing that positive role for central government, so to speak, and all the other liberties that he's embracing and espousing. So he acknowledges that there's a role, and he acknowledges that it's difficult to achieve the right balance.
I
I
was
think,
Go
go
I
ahead.
was struck by there was one section, I think it's in applications, where he was talking about there isn't just any one way that all nations have to follow. It's kind of the diversity of approaches. And it was interesting to contrast that with a colonial system that was, well, it was gearing up, let's put it that way. But it was just a recognition in 1840 or 50, whenever he wrote this, that there will be multiple ways of governing, and that could be okay within his, you know, his framework. But I don't know, I there was somehow that captured me, and that, oh, okay, yeah, that's true today. Not everybody does it the same way. We don't know what the best way is exactly. Let's see how it all plays out. So I found that paragraph especially meaningful to me.
Mario, you wanted to say something?
Well, I would just reinforce that, and, you know, he seems to be throughout, or at least in some places, very very conscious of the need to respect others' views, even if you don't go along with that way. And that goes for other cultures as well as subdivisions within your own culture, I suppose.
None of you have mentioned his views on education, which struck me as being quite modern. He thinks that everybody should have some formal education, and this certainly wasn't true in his own day.
Certainly wasn't.
He says there's an obligation to educate children.
Mhm.
Children have rights, and one of the rights is to be educated. And that's like a legal obligation on society, which certainly was not very well accepted during his time.
Certainly wasn't right.
He seemed to point to two sources of education. One was the church, which he clearly thought was not the best. And secondly, he saw public education in some form, and he queried the validity of that too. So what did that leave as a form of education? Some sort of private education. Where does that come from? And I didn't find his answer to that.
When he talks about education, of course, he's talking, I think, as much about the socializing effects of education as about the development of particular skills. In fact, doesn't he say at one point that if people reach adulthood without having a proper respect for the customs of their society, well, then that's a fault in the education process, because there has been plenty of opportunity to inculcate those values, and he seems to feel that that's a job of education.
Are there any other reasons why education is so important for him? I mean, he writes quite a bit about that.
To the
Okay.
farmer's market.
Okay.
She may not be coming. Does he have a little heart?
I think he had the idea or the belief that the evolution of an individual was dependent upon the education they got, and the education they got was also related to being able to read, because he didn't seem to think that if there was no written language, there was no history. So it seemed like it ties in with Darwin is coming out a little bit later, but there's a lot of reflection in the scientific community about thoughts about how we came to be, how progress happens. And I think he probably is seeing education as critical for on an individual basis, the evolution of thought to where you are worthy of joining the table for the discussion.
And how about how about the needs of society, not just the individual?
Well, that's really what that's what the socializing effect is all about. It's teaching people to be members of a larger society. It's teaching them what the society has to offer. They may reject it. They have that right, but it's still the job of education to give them something to rebel against, as it were.
I wonder how many people
Right.
at that time could read and write. What was the level of literacy in the society?
Yeah,
Right.
quite slight.
Yeah, I thought
Yeah.
he wanted education so that this level of society would be better for addressing questions positively and negatively towards some progress, towards truth. So if we're not educated at all, we're not able to read and so forth, you couldn't participate and express your own individual liberty constructively
Yeah.
as a member of society.
And
Yeah.
isn't that a fundamental part of what is involved in any democracy? I mean, he's talking about democracies, really, not under totalitarian governments. You don't need to read or write, of course, and maybe a whole lot of the other options that Bruce Nelson mentioned earlier. But a democracy cannot function if its citizens are illiterate.
Well, India does pretty well.
As a practical
No
matter,
questions about.
he lived in India a lot and worked for the East India Company.
No, that was his father. That was his father.
No, he did.
That was Mill.
Oh, okay.
Both of them worked for the East India Company.
Right.
Okay.
But
So-
I saw the initial reference to democracy wasn't as a system of government. If I'm correct, on liberty, the original reference to democracy was that there are two parties in England: the Democratic Party, which emphasizes equality, and the Conservative Party, which emphasizes property. And there's a dialectic between them, and it's good to have two parties going at it. Is that right?
Well, I think it's more fundamental that he's talking about democracy, which is an organization where people have a major say in the government through their representatives, he says. But nonetheless, the foundation is that people have a voice in the government, quite apart from the whole party issue. That's what I take him to be fundamentally concerned with. So that the education is important both for the development of the individual and for the functioning of a democratic society.
I
Yeah, it
wonder
is.
what he would say about our society at this point in time. I was kind of amused when I read, he says, what the French are in military affairs, the Americans are in every kind of civil business. Let them be left without a government. Every body of Americans is able to improvise one and to carry on that or any other public business with sufficient amount of intelligence, order, and decision. I didn't sense that this is the way things are here now. And I think he kind of idealizes the American experiment at that point in time.
I don't think they were that way then
Right.
either.
No, well, only
Yeah.
a certain class, the class he liked was that way. Everybody else wasn't.
Right.
Okay,
I
well,
think
let's switch from that and go to your lists that you sent in. Thank you all for responding to that, and I hope I've been fair in collating them. And you are all real acknowledge that some of these things nobody could have anticipated. So you weren't blaming Mill for lapses, but rather there have been remarkable changes in technology and other things that you wrote about that he couldn't have been aware of. So now what I hope to do in our discussion for the rest of the time, I hope we don't get involved in arguing about the issues, because I'm not sure that would take us any place, and it's not what this course is about. As I said in my welcoming letter to all of you way back in April, I said what the course is about is trying to understand Mill on liberty and to consider him critically. That is, to think about ways in which you thought he had some good points and good arguments, and in ways which you thought he did not. So our discussion is going to be about Mill, not about the issues. Most of you wrote about, almost all of you wrote about the development of media technology. And so I'd like to go from one of these topics to another, cover as many as we have room for, and ask you, on the basis of your understanding of Mill, if he were alive today, what would his position be about our involvement with media, with television, that is, with modern media, television, the internet, the World Wide Web, all of that? What stand would Mill take?
Well, I don't think he would have a negative view of it. I mean, in his time, there must have been a dozen newspapers in London. I mean, there was certainly no lack of information, and not all those newspapers printed the truth. They printed rumors, and especially you see in British dramas. I don't think he would have objected to the fact that people have these forums to express their opinions. That's not to say he may not object to the opinions themselves, but I don't think the forum alone would have rattled him.
Yes, I agree with that. I think he would have supported, in theory and practice, anything that provided a means of communication of opinion, that promoted exchange. He might have deplored the tone at times, et cetera, and found other things to criticize, as we all do. But I don't think that the idea of mass communication, of whatever whatever the internet has made possible beyond traditional means of mass communication, none of that would have bothered him. In fact, he would have applauded it.
But I think he would have been dismayed at whatever he would regard as blatant disinformation. Looking at it from the point of view of an educated man, On the other hand, he would have said they're free to say what they want. But I think the perhaps thing that he couldn't have anticipated is the incredible instantaneous proliferation of facts and opinions that can sway huge amounts of people, you know, sort of an extension of gutter custom, you know, to the wide world.
Would he,
As one of our,
would he have drawn a line any place?
Well, going back to the beginning of the book, I think he would look at things based on the harm principle. In other words, he would defend your right to say whatever you think, as long as it didn't hurt someone else or hurt society. So that's the question. It's very hard to draw the line, but I think that's where Mill would come down.
I think he would be offended by the term alternative facts. I think he thought he knew what the facts were and wasn't looking for an alternative to those facts.
But
he would-
as Mike said, there were all those newspapers in London at the time, and some of them certainly dealt with alternative facts, although they weren't called that in the day. But there were some awful, nasty things that were said about particular people or on particular issues, and Mike said, and Richard seemed to agree that Mill was not going to challenge that, and so why would he challenge it today?
Again, I think and we start talking where the line should be drawn, you know, what should be, how should the internet be regulated, whatever. I think Mill's instinct would be that the cures are potentially worse than the disease. That once you start down the path of regulating speech, you really are in business of imposing one set of values, and on those who don't who don't choose to believe in them.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that, but the fact is that Mill was a great balancer. And I mean, you know, you're balancing regulation of the internet now as against free and fair elections. And so, you know, those are two fundamental rights and one's got to give. And I mean, that's usually the way the Supreme Court used to deal with it back in the day. So you got to balance it out, and Mill was a balancer. Everything he says, you got to balance one against the other. And I'm very, you know, that'd be my initial my gut instinct is not to regulate the internet. But on the other hand, when I saw some of the things that Facebook was regularly circulating during the last 2 elections ago, it was pretty appalling. I don't know the answer.
Go ahead.
In his time, if you have a low literacy rate and the only people who are potentially buying the newspaper are people who can read, that's a very small section. So I don't think the information that was going out in the newspaper was being dispersed to huge amounts of people. Now, and I don't know if Mill, I guess he could have foreseen a time. He wanted more people educated, so I guess he would have thought that the newspapers would reach more people. But
Yeah, but Bruce, let me interrupt. My question was, think about what if Mill were alive today, what would his view be about this media exposure?
I think he would salute it on one hand as a validation of his principles, an expansion of the benefits of liberty. On the other hand, to the point about being a balancer, I think he would have perhaps thought the fairness doctrine, say, that we used to have for a license to be a broadcaster was a good idea. Why? Because it tried, however unsuccessfully, or to require that any media voice present both sides, or at least have a balanced presentation. So as a balancer, he would have liked the FCC fairness doctrine. But today,
Oh, you're mute, you got on mute.
Yeah.
he would be flummoxed
Yeah.
by the unregulated explosion, not only of media types, but of audiences.
You know, there's a distinction between opinion and facts. And he always talks about opinions. And I don't know if in his own mind, he was distinguishing opinions from facts, but that's something that he might have, drawn the line on. When you're misrepresenting the facts, you're potentially doing harm. Whereas if you're just expressing your opinion about the facts, then that's something that should be allowed.
Should 4-year-olds be allowed to watch pornography?
Wow.
In Mill's,
And myth.
no,
Mill's point?
Mill had plenty of room for the regulation of the life of children. So I don't think he would have had any problem with that example. Should 40-year-olds be able to watch pornography? Yes, he would say. What?
I'm wondering if there, the reason that I threw that in there was to give you an example that I would think would be someplace where a line might be drawn.
Sure. Of course.
4-year-olds,
Yeah.
there might have been pornographic cartoons in those many London papers, but 4-year-olds weren't reading the newspapers. But these days, 4-year-olds, or whatever age you like, have access to their parents and brothers and sisters' machines.
Well,
I thought he said something. He was pretty clear about restricting the rights of the undeveloped child. So, it seemed to me it was okay for children, people on, he didn't say an age, but I don't know what it would be, 12 or 16, or I don't know what it would have been in his time, but it seemed like he was clear that these are not fully developed adults. And so it is okay for, I don't know if he said society or who would put the controls on them, but it was all okay to have controls.
it all comes down to the details of regulation. When Anthony Comstock was running wild in the late 19th century in the U.S., over the issue of obscenity, the standard was in the mind of the most vulnerable members of society could tend to corrupt. So it was basically the standard for determining whether something was obscene or not was whether a child would be influenced by it. Certainly Mill would not have have thought that you should remove pornography from the internet because children might be exposed to it. The question is, how do you keep them from being exposed to it? And if they are exposed to it, who is to be blamed? Who is to be punished? I just think that Mill would tread very, very lightly when it comes to regulation.
I think he might well have said, well, it's really up to the parents to regulate that because they're raising these kids and they aren't full adults. And it really isn't the role of the state to come in and lock up 4-year-olds because they're watching pornography.
Or their parents.
Or their parents.
I have from way back, I've known Jonathan for many, many years. I have about 6 pictures of his wife nude. Is it okay for me to circulate them?
Today,
Not if it causes harm.
No, it's
I
not.
think the harm issue. If they cause harm, no.
Listen, why don't you get those pictures out and let us decide based on the, on the evidence?
They're actually,
Where was I when these pictures were taken?
If
I'm
let's
trying-
put it
I'm
this way,
trying to- I'm trying to
if
prove-
Jonathan is naked too, then I don't think we do want to see.
I think we had the mayor of Cambridge do that, and he's no longer the mayor of Cambridge. but,
Yeah.
Well,
Hey,
in
don't we-
Burlington,
yeah.
Vermont, where I am, you can walk naked on Church Street carrying your assault rifle. And that's completely legal. I haven't seen anyone
Right.
do it, but it is legal to do it.
Right. Well, I think if you're talking about circulating pictures of individuals, then the harm question arises. We're not talking about just the effect on the viewer. We're talking about the effect on the viewed. I certainly think that Mill would recognize privacy rights of an individual, and that could include the right not to be exposed to unwanted scrutiny. I mean, this is one of those places where perhaps rights clash, and the more rights we have, they're likely to clash. But that strikes me as still, in American law, that's still a pretty a pretty strong position, that you have some control over the distribution of photographs of yourself.
Where does Mill talk about privacy rights?
He doesn't. I don't think he doesn't. He doesn't talk about them explicitly.
Not in On Liberty. I don't know. Maybe in some other place. He doesn't do it in this book.
Okay.
But it's an extension of personal autonomy. He doesn't maybe use the word autonomy either, but clearly he is talking about the full development of oneself. I think a term that we would use today is autonomy, freedom, agency, and that would include some sort of privacy, I would think, for oneself.
Or you wanted to say?
Yeah, I
something?
was just going to say, I guess one of the things that I struggle with most with Mill is that he talks about if it doesn't do harm, but he never really talks about what harm is. And I don't know if what he's saying is, maybe what he's saying is that it's up to the democracy, the majority of the people, to say what harm is. So, in your example that you just gave us, the harm is in the head of the woman. It's not there's no injury. It's just her. It's not society as a general. So when you start thinking about these different issues, it all gets down to like, what is harm And who decides that? And if I think one of the things I said, one of the problems is that, if you have a distorted democracy because money is, so influential, then, then you don't really, the whole philosophy, I think, breaks down.
I think the right to privacy is kind of fundamental now with the abortion issue coming to the fore again, because I believe that was the basis upon which the Supreme Court struck down laws that regulated abortion, finding at least an implied right to privacy in the Constitution. And that's obviously now, I guess within the next couple of weeks, not going to be the case. So that right to
Well,
privacy is a big one.
Okay,
it is. The Supreme Court also struck down rules preventing contraceptives based on a right of privacy.
Yep.
let me remind you, I'm asking about what you think Mill would think about these issues.
I think Oren's question about defining what harm is a great one, because at least to pose to ourselves as to what Mill would say today. Query, when you're talking about something that was sort of not articulated or apparent in 1859 compared to what it is today in 2022, the definition of what constitutes harm is problematical and situational and personal. I mean, I didn't follow, but wasn't there a recent brouhaha on a defamation suit involving Johnny Depp and some woman, or I can't remember what it was. I did not follow it at all, but the gravamen of the accusation had to do with defamation, which is harm to somebody's reputation, and that was left, I think, to a jury. So I don't know where. I think trying to put Mill on the screen today and have him answer Oren's question about, well, what is harm today, is one of the conundrums that we current moderns are left with. I'd love to enlist his opinion, but I don't know where he'd go.
He also, I found, sort of made a little bit of concession to some social norms. For example, indecency. He said indecency should not be permitted. Well, shouldn't somebody have a right to walk down the street nude if they want to? What's the harm there? The harm is to, my sense of what the cultural norms are. It's not any kind of physical or mental harm.
Yeah, Jonathan has the right to do that, but you don't.
Right.
Well,
the social harm in
Right.
that, the social harm in that was depicted on a Seinfeld, where the woman who was wearing just her bra was walking down the street and Kramer crashed his car into a building because of that. So there can be harm.
Right. Again,
Okay, let
but-
me switch to another topic that quite a few of you noted: the disparity of wealth in our society today and the role that money plays in politics. What if Mill were living today? If Mill were living today, what would he think and argue about with respect to those things?
Well, as I said earlier, on equality, he mentioned that the Democratic Party in Britain, which was the Liberal Party, emphasized equality, and that has gone underneath the bus, so to speak, in the United States today. We have more and more inequality and more rights
But
problem-
what, Jonathan, my question was, what would Mill say about this?
That we have too
I
much
think-
inequality.
That's what he would say.
Yeah. I'm not sure. He talks about trade, and trade should be unfettered. The government should not be involved in regulating trade.
That's right.
Although he has this odd thing, there's some workers cooperative that he supported, but so I think he'd have a hard time with what he's. I don't know whether he read Adam Smith or what his view. I mean, even at his time, he had to see exploitation and trade, but for some reason, he decided that the government should have no say about it. So, how would he look at it today? I think he'd have to struggle with that issue today, given the facts.
Yeah, I
And
found it. Go ahead, please.
I found it interesting that he was very much against anybody selling themselves into slavery, but I'm not sure
Right.
he wanted to regulate the slave trade. So I don't know.
I found it interesting that he was a supporter of free enterprise, but he also talked about fairness to labor and this labor collective idea, and it was kind of hard to balance those two. But I think he was looking for some kind of balance in his mind between those that had the means of production and those that were providing the labor. So getting back to your question, I think he would have had something to say about the disparity of wealth, because he wanted to see some kind of balance between labor and capital.
And so
Yeah.
what would he say apart from that very, very, very general statement that he made? Specifically, what would he say?
I think he would say that he could see that those that are lacking in their daily needs are being exploited by the merchant, not the merchant class, the
Corporate class.
the corporate. Yeah, I think he would have had something to say about that. Getting back to this balance.
See him as
Yeah.
a great advocate of leveling, but if confronted with legislation that taxed the rich in order to benefit the poor, I can't see that he would have found any application of his principle on liberty to oppose it. You know, he knew what taxation was, and he knew what obligation living in society imposes obligations on people to help defend and protect that society. It might not be too great a leap from there to say that it and to pay for that society. So
How
I'm
about
not
the,
sure.
how about the money how about the role that money plays in politics, which seems to make it possible for wealthy people not only to have political positions, but to determine legislation.
Well, at the
Well,
time he was in favor of the reform laws, I think. In the beginning, only property people could vote. And then that began to change with the 1832 reform law and so on.
I think he would on again, going back to harm, and also his ideal of how a society reaches truth and opinions is by open discussion and debate. And that's good for both the individual and the society. And then if you presented him and said, this amassing of wealth allows these individuals to control the media and what information is available to people to their detriment, because it can just shut off free discussion because the wealthy can control the message. I mean, I think you would have to show harm in that sense for him to buy into regulating that kind of wealth today.
It's not just the wealth. It's not just the wealthy though. For is it's corporations. If the landmark case now is Citizens United, I think decided in 2019, where corporations are unrestricted in their ability to influence our elections. I mean, it just to me doesn't seem fair, and I would hope that it wouldn't have seemed fair to John Stuart Mill.
Yeah, but
where would he draw the line?
well, I mean, I would say, according to our Supreme Court, the spending of money in elections is a form of free speech. That's the basis of those decisions. And Mills was a big advocate of free speech. Now, I think he may not have agreed that money was a form of speech, but
well, I wonder if he would have thought that corporations, as the Supreme Court seemed to say, are like they're real people, and they have the same rights as every other citizen to do what they want to do. And I think that's a pretty destructive doctrine, and it's proving that just the reality of what's happened since that point in time tends to me to prove that.
Well, the basis of that reasoning is that corporations are affected by the laws that are passed in Congress and state houses, and they ought to have something to say to the public about those laws and whether they're beneficial. So, it's hard to argue that they shouldn't have a place in the forum of ideas.
But as Land said, that the Supreme Court has determined that corporations are individuals, even though clearly they aren't in all contexts, since corporations don't pray. Corporations don't have a religious belief. Corporations don't
some corporations
fall down and break their legs. And there are all kinds of ways in which they are quite different from persons. What would Mill say about that?
I think you would say it's bogus.
Because
That's just me.
Well, I think the argument about corporations is that, corporations have certain privileges under the law that individuals don't have. I think he would say that the individuals involved in the corporation have a right of free speech. But as an organization, as corporate funds, that's the real issue is, can you use corporate funds for political purposes, not whether you can get together with your fellow employees, which you're allowed to under current law, to get together and make political expenditures through a political action committee, but it's voluntary.
I think corporations are allowed to force their employees to listen to their free speech. You will come to this meeting and hear why you shouldn't join the union.
Mhm.
Right.
Forced free speech.
This may go back to the harm issue, and I think Charlie was dead up close onto it, because he started talking about the definition of the word harm. So what was the definition of the word harm in the 1850s and 1860s in England? what was the definition?
Well, but we're talking about Don about what he would say today.
Right, well, that's what we're talking about. Everybody's talking about, it seems they're alluding to the harm that corporations do. And having owned a corporation myself, I'm like baffled. So I wanted to know myself from all of you there, are you talking about the harm that corporations do? And in Mill's time, what was that word defined as, and how would it apply today?
Going back to the problem of defining harm.
Yeah, one of my favorite examples on corporation malfeasance is always Danny Snyder, who owns now the Commanders. I mean, there was Washington, D.C. had something called the City Paper, and they ran articles very critical of Danny Snyder. And so what he tried to do is buy the paper and shut it down. So I would see Mill going, no, that's not right. You're not allowed to do that because you're cutting off the ability of people to debate the issues raised in that paper. You don't have a civil opportunity to do that once the corporations start shutting down sources of information.
That's exactly what Orban has done in Hungary. He has given government loans to his buddies to buy the media, and now he controls all the media.
Isn't on liberty all about persons, all about people, all about individuals living in a society? Everything, single chapter seems to be about people and individuals and the development of individuals and the ways in which individuals can be prevented from developing, which is not a good thing. Development of individuals is the major theme of On Liberty, both for their own sakes and for the sakes of the societies that they live in.
But he does say that, society can step in if there's harm. And like I said before, I guess that's where you get into the sticky issues of what is harm and who decides what is harm.
Yeah.
And he doesn't really deal with that at all. He does, he does put the emphasis on the individual. He says that there's no compact or contract in society between members of society, which a lot of people say there are, but he explicitly rejected that.
Well, he's rejecting from the point of view of classical political philosophy, the idea of the social contract in the state of nature. And then after that social contract comes into existence, there's another contract, which is the Constitution. So he seems to be rejecting the former. Or, that is, he's rejecting Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau.
Yeah.
Let me switch to another topic, one that Bruce Nelson down here in the corner with the earphones on, that he sent in just one of the late entries that nobody else mentioned. I think one might say without contradiction that today in our society, we have a problem with homelessness.
I got it on my calendar. I didn't know
People,
needed to, but thanks for
in San Francisco, it's the big talk, but Washington, D.C., our capital, you find people sleeping on the streets and so on. An issue that Mill doesn't address, I think, On Liberty, but it would be hard for him not to or let me say, were he presented with a situation that we have today of many, many homeless people, what would be his position concerning that?
There should be poorhouses as there were in England.
Yeah, right.
He doesn't, he doesn't deal with that. He's talking about, the individual, the rights of the individuals. He doesn't talk much about, and then he talks about the regulation of individuals, but he doesn't talk about the other functions of government, which is, to deal with poverty. What about, paving the streets or fixing the sewers or
Right.
doing all of those functions that the government, is very important functions that the government provides. He says he doesn't, I don't remember him saying anything about that.
Yeah, no, agreed. But were he presented with this information today, what on the basis of what he talks about on liberty, what would he say should be done about homelessness? Granted, he doesn't talk about it, but were he presented with that today, what would he say about how we should deal with homeless people?
So there was a section where he talked about drunkenness, and it's all right for a person to get drunk and if they're only harming themselves, but if they're being drunk also causes harm to their family, then that seemed to bring it into another realm. And so for the houseless community, I mean, on the one hand, you could say, well, there's a choice they've made, which sometimes is true, sometimes isn't. But, and so they're just harming themselves, but they all have family members, children, parents, people they used to work with that are affected by the situation that this particular person is in. So I think it would be another one of those quandaries where on the one hand, it's a choice they've made, but on another hand, there's harm that is caused by that, if it's indeed a choice. So I think he would want wise people to sit around and talk about it and come up with a reasonable solution.
Yeah, that's true.
Would he consider that society has any obligations concerning these people?
Well, as was mentioned earlier, that you had the poorhouses, the almshouse, they were like, it was understood that that was necessary. So my sense is he would have felt that something today was necessary, that for the good of society. And again, yeah, how would it be funded? Would it be private? Would it be public?
This is, there's a difference between being a libertarian, as Mill was, and being a progressive, as we define the term today, or a liberal, as we define the term today, which sees quite a large positive role for government. I think we're putting words in Mill's mouth if we try to turn him into either a modern progressive or an anti-progressive. These are just not issues that he addressed. We can pick up on bits and pieces and say, well, he supported education in some form. So I don't think he would want to see homeless children not being given some opportunity for education. But he couldn't anticipate the modern welfare state, which I threw in. I don't think you picked up on this in your summary of points for us, but I think that the rise of the welfare state changes a lot about the equation between the individual freedom and government authority. because basically we now take for granted the acceptance of certain benefits, privileges, and in return, we give up certain freedoms. So
Wouldn't Mill be not sympathetic to the welfare state?
I think he
I
might.
think he probably would be. I'm just looking at one of, when he talks about the poor law board, he
Right.
says, no locality has a moral right to make itself by mismanagement a nest of pauperism, necessarily overflowing into other localities and impairing the moral and physical condition of the whole laboring community. So he's concerned about that, I guess. I don't know whether he hits any of this head on the way we would want it to be hit, if as progressives today.
What about the non-progressives?
We're trying to root them out.
Would Mill approve of that?
No, I don't think he would.
No.
I think Mill would probably been the person that would have been, based on what Lance just said, I think he would probably be the person that would say, teach people how to get out of it. Basically, just don't give the guy a fish, teach him how to be a fisherman.
There is a Susan Collins mentality to all of that. Let's go digressing back to Susan.
But what about Mill?
Yeah, what about Mill?
Well, didn't he think there was room for,
How would Mill feel in Collins?
didn't he think there was room for both sides? You know, he talked about the two parties, and so he may not have agreed. Who knows? Would he have been a progressive or more of a libertarian, let it be kind of guy? But I kind of think he would have been somewhere in the middle, probably.
Another topic raised by not many of you, just a few, including Bruce again. The matter of healthcare in our society. I think it's possible to think about, even though he doesn't address that issue, it's possible to think about, well, if presented with that problem in our society, the unevenness of healthcare available to our citizens, what would Mill, presented with that whole new problem, what would he think about that? What stand would he take and what arguments would he make?
Well, if you go back to his utilitarianism, he would certainly say that the health system we have today does not provide the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And he would say, you know, in that sense, with harm again, the government would have some obligation to rectify that situation because it fails the test of utilitarianism, what we have today.
Yeah, I think I find myself seeing the Mill as being the elements, if you will, of interventionism by society in some shape or form is conceptually there in his celebration of liberty. He still sees the issue of harm, about which I just looked it up in Black's Law Dictionary and in the dictionary, and all it gives is nothing. It's you know, injury, harm, damage. Thank you very much. So it's left back to the beholder to determine whether or not some harm, injury, damage has occurred. We'll query who decides. And what is democratic society but the voice, quote unquote, of the people, so to speak, in deciding that, well, gee whiz, we do need a healthcare system that provides this or that. So every state in the union has a public health department. And we do have regulations on when kids can drive cars and so forth. And I think Mill, while he celebrates the necessity for liberty and tolerance and education and discourse and eccentricity and all that sort of stuff, the elements of some modulating influence that can be delegated to some centralized authority, he endorses. So I would see him as in favor of antitrust laws, for example, that would intervene, and he would see it as a necessary filter to restrain trade that monopolies might inflict on things. So I see him as being a little more progressive than I initially thought, as permitting some.
But that the example you're using, Charlie, is a negative a use of government authority in the negative sense, to stop something from happening. When we talk about healthcare, we might be talking about making something happen that is requiring a different distribution of health benefits, health resources, and that's where I just don't find enough in Mill, in that sort of positive role of government that we are accustomed to today, or I don't find enough in Mill to help me understand where he might be today on it.
He doesn't really discuss it at all that I can see. I mean,
no, he doesn't.
He talks about the individual, he talks about society, but he doesn't talk about, how do we make collective decisions to build roads or, bridges, right, or whatever that the government does. And,
they're just not germane to his arguments.
Well, but what about his central concern with the development of individuals? If individuals are left to be sick and are not treated, how can they ever develop as individuals?
I just think he was always concerned with balance between the rights of the individual and the rights of the governing body, and the privileges of the governing body and the privileges of the person. So, even in this country, the role of government in helping people is, you start out with Social Security and then the other items in the 60s, 70s, 80s. So it's kind of a new thing. So what would have you thought today? I think he would have thought there was some role.
I'd like to think that. I'd like to think that, but I was disturbed, and I don't remember this as part of Mill, but he says in countries of more advanced civilization and of a more insurrectionary spirit, the public, accustomed to expect everything to be done for them by the state, or at least to do nothing for themselves without asking from the state, not only leave to do it, but even how it is to be done, naturally hold the state responsible for all evil which befalls them. And when the evil exceeds their amount of patience, they rise against the government and make what is called a revolution. So it's like it's a hands-off attitude that you certainly hear that expressed among conservatives quite a bit. So I was kind of, disturbed by that thought, and I think he just lived within his own milieu of well-educated, well-spoken folk, and left as everybody else, the savages and barbarians. He didn't really have a great deal of respect or desire to help them rise above their savagery and barbarian background.
Except that you never
Yeah.
know in advance which children are going to develop into scientists or intellectuals or
Right.
political leaders or dentists or plumbers or whatever. So you can't really tell unless you give every youngster the opportunity.
Well, we believe that, but did Mill, he's not concerned about leveling the playing field. He's not, you can say the mind is developed by being stimulated by discussion. Well, the mind develops by being stimulated by food, by nutrition. There are more basic things than talk, than speech, but that's not within his realm of concern. He's not trying to talk about everything. So I don't think we have a right to put words in his mouth.
Yeah, I wonder what he would have thought about an 18-year-old being able to buy an AR-15 at the Walmart. That would he have regulated that? Would he be in favor of prohibiting that or not? I don't know.
Is it like buying poison? You have
Yeah,
a right to
Yeah.
I
buy.
have a right to buy poison.
Poison.
Right.
If you apply the harm principle to that question, then he clearly would come down on the side of regulating the sale and purchase of weapons of destruction.
Well, he would
Okay.
regulate what you do with the weapon, which is what we do now. I mean, nobody's arguing that the school shooting, the shooter was doing something that was legal or permitted or Mill would permit, but obviously tremendous harm was being done.
But does the society have the right to prohibit that act before it occurs?
Well, take his example.
Yes.
Says being drunk in public is not a crime, but selling alcohol to someone who's going to become drunk could be criminal or could be prohibited. Same argument applies.
Point. That's a good point.
Yeah, I like to think he had some common sense and that this doctrine of harm is, the AR-15, there should be some regulation on it. I think that's the side he would have come down on.
Going back to what Richard said earlier, I forget what led you into that, Richard, but it seemed as if you were not acknowledging Mill's emphasis on education for everybody. That seems to be a requirement that he puts upon parents and the society they live in if you're going to have a functioning democracy. A requirement.
Right.
Right, but educated people still do harm.
Mhm.
And it depends on what education they got. Did they go to XYZ religious school, or did they go to the finest private school in Georgetown? So I think there's probably a difference to be made, and it's distinction to be made. Because
And
those
was he-
folks that may have gone to XYZ religious school, I'm not sure they're going to compete on the same level or be on the same level, whatever level that is.
And was he
But
thinking?
the ones who go to religious schools are liable to be indoctrinated, he says.
Mhm.
And what you really want in education is to develop people's ability to think for themselves.
Did he, was he thinking of the entire society? This is what I'm not clear about. Or was he thinking in terms of largely the elite that he was a part of when he was talking about his whole philosophy?
He said,
Or did you just, were the working class, they could have their collectives and do their thing? And these rules that I'm setting up are kind of for the educated, and the educated may be limited to a certain portion of society.
yes. Yes.
But if he were here today with more education, he would have had confronted that in perhaps the same way.
But I think he says explicitly that some people, it turns out, for whatever reason, their innate abilities or their lack of ambition or whatever, some people then don't go very far in the education process. So yes, that happens.
But he says that, but are you saying that he's advocating education for the scullery maids? And doesn't he look at it in very much of a class perspective?
Class in the sense that there are some people who have more intellectual ambition and capability than others. That's the only class that counts for Mill.
Well, but I mean, there wasn't much mobility at that time, social mobility,
Right.
economic mobility.
Right. Yeah, that's the fact of the case, yes.
Yeah, he doesn't see education as a means of rising socially. He just sees it as a means of realizing your full intellectual potential, whatever that may be.
Exactly.
Right.
So it's not an elite socially, although it turns out to be, of course, but in principle, it's not that.
Well, it's really, I think it becomes, I don't think he intends it this way, but it becomes a screening mechanism. It's really a way of identifying the handful of people who can rise above their circumstances. And in order to do that, you have to offer it to everybody, knowing that most of them will not benefit very much from it, either socially or intellectually. But
let me return for one last question. Let me return to something that I forget who raised it earlier. Somebody, one of you, maybe Lance. Anyway, Mill is considered by many people, as Richard said, a kind of icon of liberalism. But he also says
libertarianism, I said.
Oh, no, I thought you said liberalism.
I said not liberal.
Oh, okay. Well, he is taken to be an icon of liberalism, whatever Richard said.
By people who misunderstand.
But in addition, as somebody said, he also says the best government is the least government. I mean, he doesn't say that precisely, but that's the meaning in chapter 5. And that makes him sound like a modern day conservative, an icon of modern day conservatism.
Well, that's also a direct quote from Thomas Jefferson, another icon of modern conservatism.
Yeah, although it's debatable whether he actually said it or not. But anyway, it's often
governed best which governed least. He said it.
Oh, okay.
That's the point. Maybe he should be an icon of libertarianism and not liberalism.
Yeah, I would say that. I think the term liberalism is appropriate to his thinking at the time, because it was, it was a broad base. It said, you can say what you want, you can say what you want, and we'll try to live in peace. But today, liberalism means something a bit different than it did then.
I was picking up from, if you Google Mill and liberalism, you'll find a number of people, scholars, saying Mill is taken to be not an icon, I forget what the word is, but it's like that, of liberalism.
19th century liberalism, which was a very different thing than 21st century liberalism, because of the intervention or the creation of the modern, shall we say, welfare state by liberals, but not by 19th century liberals.
Yeah, but interesting that he does talk about which the least possible government would be the best one.
Because he understood government largely in negative terms. And when we try to slot him into a world in which the government is seen by many, also in positive terms.
He must have been thinking only of what was going on in England, because he must have viewed
out of
as government as
listening
very
to it seems
positive.
to.
He must.
He said, do you know that he also is famous for saying about conservatives, meaning the conservatives of his day in British politics, that it's just not true that all conservatives are stupid. It's only true that stupid people are conservatives. I mean, that's an actual quotation that he was famous for. Well, I think we better close with that. I hope that this has been a worthwhile study for all of you. I try to get you to stick to Mill himself and not get into these present day controversies in ways that wouldn't enlighten us. But anyway, yeah, all of you participated in lovely ways, and I appreciate that. Hope you do.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your insights, Forrest.
Yeah.
Right, thank you.
What's the reading assignment for next year for us?
Now, next fall is Aeschylus, the Oresteia.
Aeschylus, wow.
Yeah,
But
the Oresteia.
Great.
I hope you enjoy. I hope you join me for that one.
Absolutely.
Thank you all.
Okay.
You take